First, this is my first time here at OpenWest, so thanks for having me. I'm really, thanks. First timer. During the day, I work as a Chief Security Officer at Purism. So we make, if you haven't heard of us, we make a security and privacy-focused hardware that runs free software. So that's sort of my day job, and then my second day job is I do editing and writing for Linux Journal magazine, which was dead and now is back to life again. We weren't quite dead, which is always exciting. But today I'm going to be talking about freedom, security, and privacy. And when you see, well, first I've been involved in this community for about 20 years now, and so I feel like I have a good sense of, have a finger on the pulse of what the community values and what the community is like. And so when you see a talk about freedom, security, and privacy, and you see a slide like this, I just kind of want to address the elephant in the room first before we move on to the actual topic. And that's the lack of Oxford commas in this title. So I'm a grammar nerd, and I do a lot of technical writing. As in the introduction, I've written a number of different books. I write magazine articles, web articles, things like that. And I've been doing it for a long time. And I hear this Oxford comma debate, and to me, it's almost, it's like arguing whether Kung Fu or Jiu-Jitsu is better. It doesn't really make any sense to me when I see people arguing pro or against Oxford commas. I say learn both styles, and then get into mixed martial arts, and then if you do that, then you can defeat people that decide, well, I only want to learn one style, right? So for me, I use Chicago style when I'm writing books, but I use AP style when I'm doing magazine and web articles. And if you do professional writing, what you'll find is that on top of that, typically each publication has their own house style, just like if you're a developer, if you join a company, each one has a variation on a coding style, right? And so, again, this debate's silly. You just use the appropriate style for the appropriate thing. So for this talk, I felt that AP style was appropriate. This is published on the web. It's closer to AP style, so I'm going to be using AP style throughout this presentation. So thank you very much for understanding. All right, on to the actual talk. So freedom, security, and privacy are interrelated, but in some cases, the relationships between those words are pretty obvious, and in some cases, they're not really that obvious, especially when we're talking about software. So it's pretty obvious that privacy is an important part of freedom. For example, there have been studies that show that if someone's under surveillance, they behave differently than if they're not under surveillance. And so clearly, if you want to be free, you need to care about your personal privacy. Also, privacy and security. So often, if you want privacy, you use security to protect it. If I want to send an email or some other communication to someone else and I want it to be private, I will use some sort of security software, some kind of encryption to protect it. So that relationship's pretty clear. But the link between freedom and security might be a little bit less obvious. And one of the reasons for this is that security often relies on secrecy. So, if you have a password, you generally don't tell everybody what it is. You keep it secret. If you have a GPG key, you typically keep that private. Well, that's led some people to conclude that, well, if something's secret means that it's secure, and, well, if something's proprietary, and does that mean that, so if something's secret is equal to secure and something's private is secret, does that mean that proprietary is automatically secure because we're keeping the code secret? So does that weigh out? In fact, you'll see this argument a lot. A lot of people that were talking about security and free and open source software will say, well, but the benefit of proprietary software is it's all closed up and it's secret, therefore it's safer. So in this talk, I'm going to be analyzing the relationships between all of these three and hopefully make a convincing argument that freedom and security are more closely linked than you would think, and that it's beneficial to have both security and freedom together. Well, first I want to sort of talk about when you talk about security in free and open source software, one of the first things a lot of people point to is the notion of many eyes making bugs shallow. So it's a core tenet that people apply to free software quality. What they'll say is, well, if you have 1 million people looking at, say, the Linux kernel's code, 1 million people are more likely to find bugs, and therefore many eyes makes bugs shallow, right? The problem is a lot of times people will apply that principle to security bugs too, and they assume, well, naturally then I'm sure that many eyes make security bugs shallow too. Well, to that I would like to offer the counterpoint of OpenSSL, Bash, and ImageMagick. These are all software that, all open source software, they all had long-standing, pretty severe bugs that were out for years, published in the source code before they were discovered. And like I said, all very severe and just sitting out wide in the open. No one really saw them until someone started to look. Of course, you can also offer the counterpoint, which is Flash and Acrobat Reader and Internet Explorer, also software of a similar vintage, also horrible security track record, right? So what does this mean? What it means is that security bugs, it's not just that you need many eyes, you need the right eyes. Security bugs need the right people looking at the code to find the bugs. In particular, the ImageMagick bugs, I'm almost convinced that it started because of the OpenSSL Heartbleed bugs, and everyone got this renewed interest in free software that was embedded in embedded devices or used otherwise. And so security researchers started wanting to be the next Heartbleed and started researching all of this other software looking for security bugs. So black box or not, researchers, if they look, they will find bugs in the software. That's just how it will work. So proprietary or not, security bugs just basically require someone looking at it. All right, so story time. Let's talk about one time when security's relationship to freedom was that having security reduced freedom. So that time when secure boot was the only option. So, you know, I work for a company that produces hardware. We also produce a Linux distribution that's based off of Debian called PureOS. And so sometimes people don't necessarily just run our distribution on our hardware. They also sometimes run on other hardware. So we were evaluating a laptop, and that laptop, like a little small, low-cost laptop, and it had Secure Boot installed by default. So we go to install PureOS, we plug in the USB stick and start to try to install, and it won't boot. And we're like, okay, well that's weird. Oh, it's probably because Secure Boot is turned on. Well, if you're not familiar with Secure Boot, what this does is it's software that starts in a UEFI system, so that when you turn on the computer, it inspects the first code that you're going to execute. If that code's been signed by essentially Microsoft or a vendor that Microsoft has authorized, it will execute the code. If it's not signed, it will refuse to execute it. And the idea behind this is to prevent malware from executing and taking over your system at boot time. So its genesis is based in security, although if you read, you know, in the community, sometimes there's been some concern about its relationship to open source and free software. But companies like Red Hat and Canonical have worked with Microsoft to get their certificates added. So for example, you can install Ubuntu and Red Hat on a system with Secure Boot enabled. If you don't want to install those two pieces of software, it's easy. All you do is, if you want to install Debian, you just turn Secure Boot off. And so that's typically what you'll hear. We'll turn the security feature off, and you are free to install whatever you want. The problem here, though, was that this was a pretty low-cost laptop, and the boot configuration was very, very stripped down. It had only a couple of options, and conveniently enough, Secure Boot disabling was not one of those options. So that means if you bought this laptop, you could install any software as long as it was signed. It has certificates signed by Microsoft or other approved vendors. Otherwise, you couldn't. It was a brick to you, right? Well, so the good news is that there are alternatives to Secure Boot that aren't just equally secure, but potentially more secure, but you also get freedom along for the ride. So there's a free software project called Heads that provides tamper-evident boot, that you get a similar functionality to Secure Boot, and in some ways stronger. It's also kind of closer to verified boot. But the way that it works is you store the measurements for your BIOS, all of the first code that's executed in the TPM chip, that's the secure chip that's on your machine. You also, Heads allows you to assign all of your files in the boot directory, so your kernel, your initrd, your grub configuration, all of those files are signed with your own GPG key, not some company certificate. When you boot, Heads will check the measurements of itself in the BIOS against what's stored in the TPM. and validate to you that it hasn't been tampered with. It'll also check all of the signatures in your boot directory. And if any of those have changed, it will alert you. So you get the benefits of secure boot or things like that, except in this case, the keys are completely in your control. If you decide to change your keys one day, you can change them as often as you like. If you want to have your keys and a friend's keys, that's up to you. You can change it whenever. The machine's under your control, and you can install whatever operating system you want. There are also some circumstances where security in closed software ends up reducing privacy. So most of you, I'm assuming, have heard about about Snowden and all of the NSA operations involved in that. So Glenn Greenwald, who was one of the people that broke that story, also wrote a book about his experiences in that called Nowhere to Hide. And in addition to sort of telling a biographical account of this story, he also dropped a couple of kind of 0 days about NSA exploits. And one of them was about backdoors that were planted in Cisco products. And the way that this would work is that if the NSA saw that a Cisco product was being shipped internationally to a target, they would intercept the package in transit, open it up, implant a backdoor, close it back up, and use the factory seal so that it looked like it hadn't been tampered with, and then ship it off. So in case you're on Team Juniper and you're not on Team Cisco, you're also, are a victim too. So NSA is also suspected in a backdoor in Juniper firewalls. So it was implanted in ScreenOS. They looked backwards when they discovered that this existed years later, that somewhere around mid-2012, this backdoor was put into the code. It looked fairly innocuous at the time. And what it did was it allowed admin access in VPN decryption over SSH. Now, there's plenty of other examples like this, not just from the NSA doing this. Other governments are known for doing this sort of thing. Also, just companies, sometimes you'll either have a rogue employee or a debug account that was accidentally left with a default password, things like that, right? But the point is, in all of these cases, you have this closed network hardware with this firmware that now why would they want to modify this? Well, they want to modify this so that they can snoop, they can decrypt VPN traffic and do other things that would otherwise be secure, and therefore defeating your privacy if you happen to be traversing that network. The problem with closed source software is that this is a hard problem to solve. How do you know that firmware hasn't been modified when you're either as you're downloading it from the site, or has it been modified before you even get a piece of hardware? How do you know that hasn't been tampered with? Closed source software really doesn't have an answer for this, but free and open source software does. So sort of blazing the trail in this way in secure software using something called reproducible builds. So the idea behind reproducible builds is it answers the question, does the binary that I get from my distribution, does it match the code that they got from upstream? Or was something added to it, or was a backdoor put in it? So what reproducible builds allow you to do is to test for these backdoors and binaries, but you can test for them using the code that's available upstream. So you don't necessarily have to trust the vendor for the binary. You can validate that trust yourself. So the way that it works is you download the source, you compile it yourself on your own system under your control, and you can compare the output, that binary that comes out of that compilation, with the binary that the distribution ships. And with reproducible builds, they're supposed to match. If they don't match, then you can suspect that somewhere along the way, that binary was tampered with in some way. This allows you to verify this. So for instance, Debian is working to make, and if you're familiar with Debian, you know how many packages that they include, right? I mean, it's a huge number. They're working to make every single package reproducible now, which is this big effort. Of course, they're not alone. Arch, Fedora, Cubes, Heads, Tails, Corbett, a lot of other projects are working to make implementations of this reproducible build because it's incredibly important for security. It's also something that proprietary software you just couldn't do. Can you imagine downloading the source code for, Acrobat Reader and compiling it to check whether or not it's been tampered with, or Cisco firmware or something like that? I don't see that happening, right? at least not while it's closed. You have to open up to be able to get this security benefit. So let's talk a little bit about, well, why not just have all three? How do all three, freedom, security, and privacy, relate to each other? So let's first talk about iOS and Android. They give pretty good examples because you don't have much of a choice right now. In your pockets, you have a device probably that runs either one of these operating systems or the other. So how do they manage this balance? So we'll start with iOS. So let's see, on the security front, they're known for being very solid on security. They take a lot of effort in making iOS secure, making iPhone secure, things like that. They also have, at least from what they've said publicly, they seem to care about privacy. I would say if the security on an iPhone is a 9 out of 10, then maybe the privacy is like a 7 or something like that. Maybe they don't have a financial interest in harvesting data, right? And so that's a plus. So we'll give them that. Now on the freedom front, of course, then that goes pretty far down, right? We're talking walled gardens and things like that. So if we're putting all three and doing scales, then you would see that the balance is really security heavy, okay, and privacy, and then freedom is way down low. Okay, well now let's rate Android. So they're not necessarily as good as iOS as far as security. People that are in Android security would disagree with me, I understand, but just in general, it's a little bit less. Freedom, it's better than iOS. It's free-ish, I mean, if you dig under the hood, you can get into a GUI Linuxy center somewhere, and you can get parts of the code of Android you can build yourself, and then on top of it's a lot of proprietary apps. So the freedom aspect is better than iOS, but not great, kind of like privacy on iOS. But then the privacy aspect, of course, is a 0, right? You don't get Android assuming that your personal data is, that's the whole purpose, right? You understand that that's the trade-off, right? And so you don't really have this is a good example, both of these products, of how these three concepts merge or don't merge in reality, which is unfortunate because my argument is that it's better when it's together. So to me, if you want to protect both your security and your privacy, you need freedom. You also need control over that software. Now, why is it so important to have freedom and control? Well, without that, both your security and your privacy requires you to fully trust the vendors that are providing you your software. Well, why is that problematic? My vendor is very trustworthy. The problem is that you don't, and you may not always know this, but your vendor may or may not have your best interests at heart. They may have some other ulterior motives that are driving their decisions that maybe it's not based purely on your security and privacy. The other thing is it's hard to revoke trust. Well, if you decide, okay, well, I like this vendor, but now, they've done some shady things. I found out that, they accepted $10 million from the NSA potentially, maybe to promote this backdoor crypto algorithm, things like that. So I'm going to revoke my trust from them. It's really hard in some cases to remove trust from an organization you've trusted, in particular when we're talking about privacy, because you've already given them all of your data. So how do you get that data back in a way? If you don't trust them, then you're not going to be able to trust that, well, yeah, we totally, deleted all of your stuff on our side. Don't worry about it. If you pick Floss products, then this gives you control of the trust that you give. You can revoke it in all of your data, and the code is under your control. You have a better sense of what the code's doing. It gives you control of trust. In particular with reproducible builds, you don't even necessarily have to trust. So if you can say, well, I feel pretty good about my distribution, I think they're pretty trustworthy, but what if, even if they're trustworthy, what if something were intercepted in flight or something like that, which is possible. With reproducible builds, you don't have to just trust them. You can verify all of this on your own and feel a little bit better about this. And again, this is something that isn't offered in the proprietary world. So, essentially, my argument is that adding freedom to this equation results in both stronger security and stronger privacy. And so it's not just that freedom, security, and privacy are interrelated, but I would argue they're interdependent. So as you increase one, you increase the others, and as you, for example, remove freedom from a product, you also diminish its security, maybe in an unnoticed way when you're first looking at it. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for having me.